I hope it's all right with you if we're recording this, David.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased that David Hughes could come and join us in launching his book. And although the book only came out a month or two ago, I think this is the perfect date to have this discussion, because if any of you watching this are still stressing out about what Christmas gifts to get, just order a bunch of books, and I promise you won't regret it, because it's not just a fascinating book and an important one, it's also a thing of beauty. It's just a joy to read. It really sparkles. I see the book as a kind of coffee table manifesto. So you can read it from one angle as a kind of crusading book and an eco-socialist manifesto. It's got a message, and it spells it out very loud, very clear. Build more wind turbines, millions more, and this is how we should do it. But if you read it from another direction, it's an artwork. It's an exquisite, sumptuous book. When I was reading it, I almost felt the Andalusian wind brushing my skin, and so these two aspects of the book, there's the campaigning thrust and the aesthetic gloss, the polish. They're not separate. They work very much in tandem, because the book isn't just about wind power. The book is an ode to wind power. It's a book that's trying to win our love for landscapes that bristle with turbines, and for the people who can make those landscapes happen. And proponents of wind energy are really going to have to learn to work with the beauty of the land and the beauty of the people. And in his passion for carpeting the world with these high-tech turbines, David's agenda, you could describe it in one sense as eco-modernist. He wants to plaster the planet with machines. I'm quoting, "My landscape of utopia sprouts with steel." But it's not a brash version of eco-modernism. It's romantic, it's humanist. It has no illusions in social engineering. Environmentalists and energy engineers, they can't simply impose their plans on people. They're going to have to find ways of working with the people they find and showing sensitivity to their cultures, their traditions. And this is where ethnography becomes politically vital. So David is an anthropologist, and he did his field work in a little nook of Andalusia. And the journey he takes us on in this book, it's a very expansive journey. It swoops around the history of Spain and its empire and all sorts of literature and art and all manner of other things. But it always flies back home to this little corner of Andalusia, and it's there that we find sparks of hope in picaresque style, in the people who are ducking and diving around the economic margins. So environmentalists often focus on high politics and on corporations and business elites and NGOs, but we also need to get to know the poor. And this is a book that very much sides with the poor, but not in any simplistic way. David's subjects, his ethnographic subjects, they taught him that renewable energy and social justice are not natural bedfellows. Now, if the poor can benefit from wind energy, they will gain, and so will the world. But a lot hangs on that if, for who, in fact, does own the wind. What fascinated, one of the central question in the book, which fascinated me when I first read it, because I hadn't thought of that really before. And in many countries, that question, in legal terms, only so far has a tentative answer. The landowner owns the wind. He or she owns the wind rights. But David is introducing us to a number of different angles here, to the powerful forces that are tightening the grip of the landowners, pointing ultimately toward a dystopian future when the last remaining commons become privatized, where even the moving air becomes enclosed in property rights. And here we get to the political nub of the book, because these ownership laws, they're not only unjust, they're also constraining wind energy expansion. You see, wind farmers, they require scarcity to keep their profits turning. And at the moment, he argues, I think, in this book, we're at a critical juncture at which property rights over wind are still not settled. They're up in the air to some extent. And so now, and here's the manifesto bit again, now is the time to nationalize the wind. Not just the turbines, not just the land on which they stand, but the wind. If the wind owner were the state, the royalties would fall into public hands as a sovereign resource, much as oil in some countries. And from this step, David goes on to argue essentially that, well, I mean, that environmentalists should approach these sorts of questions, or this particular question anyway, through a politics of plenty. With the political will, he writes, I quote, renewable electricity could graduate from megawatts and gigawatts up to terawatts. Now, at this point in the argument, and I'm almost finished, I'll hand over to David in just a second. At this point in the argument, with the gigawatts turning into terawatts, you can sense that it's developing along standard left eco-modernist tracks. More and more energy is going to be needed by an ever-growing economy, so we need the world carpeted with turbines. Except then, right at the end of the book, we get to an intriguing little twist. There's a delightful moment of hesitation or ambivalence, if you like, where we're considering, well, maybe there are other ways of living a good life in Andalusia, even without the forests of wind turbines, at least not so vast forests. Maybe just a few solar panels on each house could suffice for a decent life. And I think here in the book, there's a really creative ambivalence. It connects to quite central debates on the left, and that's where I should leave it for now. I have a few questions for later on, which I can direct to David later, but for now I'll leave it at that and hand over to David to maybe say a few words, however long you like, 10 minutes, 20, 30, 40, whatever.
All right, thanks so much, Gareth. As I say, I'm really grateful for the way you've supported this book from the beginning. I'm going to take maybe 10 or 15 minutes just to sort of frame the book and read a couple of passages. So let me start with where the book starts as a little reading. Fossil fuels should be over and done with. They spawn corruption, pollution, and death from Nigeria to New Orleans. A just world, one concerned to protect itself from climate change, would have abandoned them long ago. Now, late in the game, we need to switch rapidly to renewable energy, a large chunk of which will come from the wind. Yet this energy transition is not certain, maybe not even likely. There are preconditions, some quite difficult. It is not simply a question of installing technology, erecting it, plugging it in, and wiring it up. The energy transition is a social transition too. The burning of fossil fuels must end in a way that is fair. Unfair conditions limit the shift to renewables and thereby perpetuate oil. To make enough electricity, wind needs justice. I began this inquiry as, in quotations, a cautious moderate in relation to the Green New Deal. At that time, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Edward Markey had not yet delivered their manifesto. That's the Green New Deal, but its broad outlines already circulated in the US left. Renewable energy would bring in its sidecar both universal health care and an employment guarantee. Effectively, this plan would overturn much of capitalism and all of fossil fuels. For a social critic like myself, what was not to like? But it seemed too heavy a political lift. A society cannot stabilize the climate on an emergency basis while undertaking simultaneously the friction-filled work of reforming the economy. Be pragmatic, set your priorities. So I thought, as many others on the US left, as did many others on the US left, we prepared yet again to defer a reckoning with inequality. So one strain of the book is about how I changed my mind and how the people in this village, which I called Sereno, persuaded me that wind does need justice, and you cannot simply carpet the world with wind turbines as a technological, high eco-modernist kind of transformation. And what happened in Sereno that changed my mind was a failed local protest against wind turbines. And I know you have many of these kinds of protests in the UK, and they're happening all over, and happening in the US West and the US East, and in a bunch of parts of Europe now, even Germany, communities are protesting against wind farms. The protest in Sereno did fail locally, and which is why it is one of the more surrounded turbine villages in the world. But the protest succeeded at the regional level, at the level of the province of Cadiz, so that the wind farms that surround this village were the last ones put in that province, and none have been put in since about 2006. And there were other villages and towns protesting against them, and that gathered force of opposition and of kind of the soft regulation that comes about through environmental impact assessments and social consultations and so on. All that made the investment seem unattractive to big wind, as well as what Gareth mentioned. The big wind doesn't necessarily want to carpet the world with wind farms, not now at any rate, because that drives down the value of wind-produced megawatts. So the energy transition slowed down, and it's been stuck in Spain at 18 or 19% grid density. That is 18 or 19% of the megawatts produced on the grid are coming from wind. There's a small portion coming from solar as well. It's been stuck there for about 10 years. Things are stalled in terms of onshore wind in the UK as well. In the US, we are expanding very rapidly from starting at a very low point. And so in the US, when we look at Europe, we see success. When I look at Europe, I see early success and current failure because of the failure to deal with the energy transition as a social transition. And the real, you know, when you look at these protests, most people who support renewable energy and study these protests take a dismissive attitude that these are uneducated, conservative, rural people taking a selfish, not in my backyard attitude, and they simply have to be rolled over in the interest of the greater common good. And again, that was my attitude when I started as well. But what I saw is that they're protesting against a certain kind of industrialization, a certain kind of corporate-led profit-taking and building, which stands opposed to local traditions and especially aesthetic values. And that if one can take into account those local traditions and aesthetic values, then there is a possibility to do a different kind of energy transition. And a lot of it depends on who owns the wind, as Gareth was saying, and how the wind is claimed, by whom, on what logic, and for whose benefits. Let me read you another little excerpt here from page 28 here. This book considers the benefits, losses, compromises, and sacrifices of life in this newly technological countryside. I anticipate conflict. Energy will have to find space amid rural production and conservation. Solar voltaics will compete with agricultural photosynthesis, namely crops. Wind turbines will clutter the horizon. To stabilize the climate, rural people will have to adjust to whirling blades above concrete foundations. One can intersperse turbines amid wheat, sunflower, and other crops. Even more easily, one can run cattle through a wind farm. But field and range do not appear the same under rotors. The rustic, the bucolic, all these qualities we associate with the countryside will give way to machines. The world after fossil fuels simply looks different. How should we consider, appreciate, or reject the aesthetic qualities of wind energy? Let me say a word about that, actually. Landscape is very much at stake here. For 100 years or more, 150 years really, we've been harvesting a subsidy from fossil fuels in spatial terms. Usually one thinks about, of course, the free gift from nature in energy terms. But fossil fuels are actually very parsimonious in terms of space. From a hole in the ground, if it's oil from a hole in the ground that's a meter wide, you can get enough energy to power a city. And, you know, refineries and pipelines and gas stations and things like that will take up some space, but not very much. It's actually in horizontal terms, fossil fuels are very efficient because most of the space being used, both for the production and both for the sourcing of it, the source of it and the sink of it is above. So you've got a vertical movement rather than a horizontal spread. Fossil fuels, renewables, of course, are going to be entirely different. There is that abundance which Gareth mentioned. We get 162,000 terawatts of solar energy hitting the atmosphere at any given moment. It compares with 11 terawatts from fossil fuels, not 11,000, but 11 versus 162,000. So we have an enormous resource, but it's not concentrated. It's distributed. And so that whole energy system that we have, which is vertical, is going to have to kind of turn 90 degrees and occupy the planet's surface. And so people who are used to a compact energy system are going to have to get used to something different. One of the things I teach my students is we like to talk about hiking in the Appalachian Trail, which runs north to south on the Appalachian Mountains. And most of them are not aware that in order to climb a mountain in the Appalachians, they drive maybe 100 miles and then walk maybe 5. And when I go through this for 20 minutes, they realize, oh, there's a fossil fuel subsidy there. But then I ask them, well, why is the forest there that you're walking through? And they say, well, it's a natural forest. And I say, well, no, it's actually a secondary forest. It was all cut once for fuel wood. And why was the regrowth not cut for fuel wood too? Through a rotation or something. And they say, well, I don't know. And I say, well, it's the same reason you were able to drive there, because we're using the fossil fuels. So there's this incredible spatial subsidy for recreation, for agriculture, for residents, and for what we consider to be the aesthetic qualities of a traditional landscape right now. So I have 2 sets of recommendations that flow from that. I mean, the first is the one that that gives the book an aesthetic quality, and there I don't have a silver bullet. There has to be compromise. I think one has to approach rural people as in villages like Sereno as having lost something through wind turbines. That, for many of us who live elsewhere and go through a landscape with wind turbines, if we support the energy transition and we're concerned about the climate crisis, we find them inspiring, we find them sublime. And we say to ourselves, this is fantastic, this gives me hope. But we're visitors. If you live among these turbines and you knew the landscape growing up, and maybe your parents and grandparents and so on, as a landscape of cattle and grain and so on, then wind turbines are an intrusion of the most machine-like, mechanistic quality, benefiting somebody else. All right, and so we have to take these feelings seriously. One way to do that is to talk to people and to design turbines a little differently, but also to see them differently. So I spent a lot of time talking to my informants who are not parochial people. Some of them have traveled to the US, and we talked about the Golden Gate Bridge. Any of you been to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco? I don't see a lot of, don't know. Okay, anyway, but you've probably seen postcards of it. The postcards of it are beautiful, and they're taken from the other side of the bay, looking at it perpendicularly, seeing it from left to right. If you cross it, you see it straight on, and you just see the car in front of you. But most people who cross it while they're looking at the car in front of them are not thinking about the car in front of them. They're thinking about they're sort of having an out-of-body experience and seeing the bridge with their mind's eye in the perpendicular direction, seeing it as a beautiful span from left to right. And so I explored with some people in Sereno how they see turbines, how they photograph them, how they imagine them when they're not actually looking at them. And I found a great deal of flexibility there, and people's sentiments changing, and people starting to see the turbines as having a kind of fit, a kind of swooping, swirling fit with the rolling plain of Sereno. So there is a possibility for aesthetic compromise if one approaches it the right way with humility and with generosity. which there, I haven't seen very much of that, frankly, in the kind of corporate wind sector. The part of it that's more of a manifesto, that's a more determined manifesto, is what to do about property. And here I say that I was persuaded that wind needs justice, but I actually kind of find a shortcut. So as Gareth said, the practical problem in most of the world that's really leading in wind energy investment is that there's been a kind of informal agreement that land rights, so the wind rights should follow land rights, and that the landowner should own the value, the kinetic energy of the air passing over his farm or her farm, and therefore should be able to sell those wind rights to a developer, to an operator of a wind farm, and get an income stream through royalties. And what this means is that the landowner gets two income streams. The one that comes from renting out the pads, that's the area about half the size of a football field, where the turbine actually occupies, and the access roads. So the farmer is losing some fraction of a hectare in production and is, I believe, entitled to an annual rent for that land. That's the first payment. The second payment, though, comes as a fraction of the value of the electricity produced from each turbine. That's a royalty payment. It's not often called a royalty payment. In Oklahoma it is, but elsewhere it's kind of made a little bit ambiguous through different terms. So you've got to ask yourself, why should the landowner get that royalty? What did that person do to deserve that royalty? You know, under Lockean theory, you wouldn't say the landowner produced the wind. The landowner, under market theory, the landowner didn't buy the wind. The landowner didn't invest in the wind. The wind is just there, again, as a free gift from nature. And it's not even a feature of the landscape. It's coming from outside and going to the other side. So I think there's some logic to say that we could sever land rights from wind rights. And the way in which that's a shortcut is that the other alternative is to say, well, let's redistribute land, right? In southern Spain, land is owned very unequally, going back to the so-called Reconquista from the Moors. Aristocratic families have monopolized rural land, used it very ineffectively. And so around Sereno, there are 2 or 3 families that own tens of thousands of hectares and are monopolizing all of these profits. They and the corporations are monopolizing all the profits from wind energy. So the tried and true but failed strategy is to try to redistribute land. And I've worked in land reform projects. I did work in land reform projects for many years in Zimbabwe, where we kind of got too much of a good thing at the end of the day. But you know, land reform is nowhere near succeeding in Spain. Because of course, a lot of people don't want to farm anymore anyway. So you can beat your head against a wall as a socialist and say, now we really need to redistribute land because it also comes with wind. Or you can try the shortcut and say, we have actually a new space here. We have these 162,000 terawatts. Nobody's claiming them, or at least not very effectively, at least not in very strong law. Nobody's claiming those terawatts very, very well. So let's, continue fighting, but over the 11 or so that are on Earth. But just above Earth, we've got this whole new frontier for socialism or for capitalism. And this is what we need to fight over. And it's not that difficult because the landowners mostly don't know that they can claim the wind. The corporations don't care a whole lot either way. Governments ought to care, but don't. And by the way, I'm a little bit agnostic on the question of whether one should nationalize the wind or vest ownership in municipalities or in view sheds or in little villages like Sereno or in Mexico, in ejidos or in tribes in the United States. You know, I think it would depend very much on context. So I'm not straight out in favor of nationalization everywhere. But I do think that we've got to take it out of the hands of the landowners. And I think it's not that difficult. One of the funny things, though, the odd things, is talking to trade unionists and socialists. It's been a little bit difficult to persuade them to think about the wind as a thing. They're very used to wanting to own the factory and the pipeline and the refinery. But there have been calls in the UK. The same question is who owns the wind is the title of a few reports in the UK, and they're all about infrastructure. And I'm saying the infrastructure is important, but you have so much more power if you control the ultimate resource, and the ultimate resource is easier to claim. So that's where I leave it, within a compromise on aesthetics, with a compromise deeply informed by local traditions and relationships on aesthetics, and on property, a manifesto that would fit on your coffee table. So, so thank you very much. I'll hit it back to you, Gareth, for whatever questions and discussions we'll have. Oh, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, David, for that introduction to the book. Now, if I had arranged this meeting properly, I would have invited discussants, but I haven't done so. Never mind. I have a few. I'll kick off some discussion and allow some time for the rest, for anyone else to think of their questions. I'll start by throwing a few questions at David. He can come back on them, and then we'll open it to the floor. So the first one is, there are a lot of wind turbines in this book. I should have held the book up, by the way. Here it is. There are a lot of wind turbines in it. And they're discussed in a lot of different ways. Their ability to change the world, their appearance, the problem of birds, all sorts of things are discussed. But the materials and the energy and the human labor that they require is all hidden from view. It's as if the turbines are not only turned by thin air, they're made of it as well. And this, for me, makes consideration of their massive global expansion a little less problematic than it should. Now, I basically am convinced by David's position. I think that, well, I was previously, even to reading the book firmed it up. There need to be an awful lot more wind turbines in the world. But you know, concrete is, after hydrocarbons, the most greenhouse gas emitting material there is, and so and neodymium is involved in these things, and so on. So, how would you respond to that question? The second question is, I'm not entirely convinced by your claims about the amount of space that would be needed for these machines. I mean, at one stage, you almost seem to imply, if I read correctly, that much of the land area of the world would be needed. I suppose offshore wind farms is increasingly the alternative that makes that scenario unnecessary. How do you configure those questions? And then my final question is, you know, the closing paragraph of any book is important, and in the final three sentences, I mean, of yours, we have basically more of a political manifesto. Go, if you're American, go to the polls and vote Dem, because President Biden, at last, is prepared to listen. And I'm much more skeptical on this point, since President Biden is authorizing all sorts of, you know, new drilling of oil and so on. Are you still as optimistic vis-a-vis President Biden as you were when you finished your book, or was it largely essentially driven by fear of Trump? All right, there are a few questions. If you could respond to one or two of them.
All right. Great, fabulous questions. Thanks, Gareth. Let me take them in reverse order here. You know, the book in the introduction and here and there, I'm arguing against despair. And that's why the last part of the title is the hope of renewable energy. So I'm arguing against people like Roy Scranton and the what is it name? Franzen, I've forgotten his first name. Jonathan Franzen and others who say basically we're doomed. Eric Scranton likes to say we're fucked. And I find that's a very easy thing to say, especially by people who don't have an arrest record on this issue. I'm trying to find hope where I can find it, because I want to write as Raymond, is it Raymond Williams or is it The Economist? I'm losing my memory for names right now. Who says you write not to make despair believable, but to enlarge the space for hope, essentially. Otherwise, why write anything? Why read anything if you already know that possibilities are foreclosed? So I chose to be hopeful in the book, and I chose to be hopeful. I'm still choosing to be hopeful about Biden. I do think that the authorization of new oil development is the worst thing that can possibly happen. And it's fabulous that you just won the campaign against that oil field, or was it a gas field in Scotland?
Cambo.
Yes, yeah, that's a fantastic victory. We hope for that kind of thing to happen more in the US. The truth of the matter is, and I do say this somewhere in the book, when you're looking at wind turbines and seeing in them the end of oil, you're actually looking at the wrong thing. You can put up 1,000 wind turbines and 1,000 solar farms, and you will have done nothing to reduce carbon emissions. And that's in fact exactly what happened in Spain. They put up 18%, they added 18% grid density, but they kept on burning the same amount of fossil fuels with the same, actually over that 20-year build out in wind and solar, their carbon footprint went up 1% on the national level. So it's absolutely critical to focus attention on shutting down oil and gas. And putting up wind farms is great too, but we don't actually need wind farms. What we need is to stop emitting fossil fuels. So I guess I'm a little bit less sanguine about Biden than I was when many months ago I sent in the proofs because Biden is not shutting down the oil, gas, and coal industry fast enough. On the question of land area, yeah, people have done various calculations about how much land we need for solar and wind farms. It's not everywhere. It's not a carpet over the terrestrial world by any means. But it is more land than the places that people find convenient. So I'll give you an example in my state, New Jersey. Nobody wants onshore wind turbines in New Jersey. And so the politicians and particularly the investors said, no problem, no problem. We've got a very wide continental shelf. We can provide 90% of our electricity by building them 10 kilometers offshore where people aren't really going to see them. They're going to be far out there, hundreds and hundreds of really huge, the new 14 megawatt size wind turbines offshore. And you'll never have to see them. And, some people onshore in the beach communities are still protesting this. But, in New Jersey, we're comfortable with this idea. However, that covers 90% of our current electricity needs. There's the other 10%. And then there's the other 60% when we electrify all the cars. The assumption being that people will continue to drive as much as they ever drove, but now their car and in single passenger cars all over the place to get a quart of milk down the road, they'll still drive and it will be in a Tesla or something like that. So where does the other 60% of electricity come from? It's going to have to come from something onshore. And that means all these turbines, will march on land and up the beach and into communities. We're a very densely populated state. We either have completely built out suburbs or we have uplands which people want to recreate in and which they find to be beautiful and bucolic and so on. So there's going to be a huge conflict. I think that I'd rather have that conflict happen now than happen later. I think it's a mistake it's a political mistake in New Jersey to reassure people that they won't have to look at turbines and that they'll all be offshore, because we are not preparing them for life with turbines. We're making a false promise that you can have your energy transition without a turbine, in your view. And false promises, of course, may always make compromise difficult 5 or 10 years down the road. And I hope it's only 5 or 10 years, because we don't have longer. On the question of materials, yeah, this is something I didn't deal with sufficiently in the book, probably. As you pointed out, Gareth, it's an ethnography of Sereno, where I look at the generation of electricity, but I didn't look at the manufacturing of the turbines, which takes place elsewhere. There's that fantastic article by James Meek, which looks at turbine manufacture, the Scottish offshore turbine blades being made in Vietnam under horrible environmental and particularly labor conditions. One of the things I think I'll get into in future research is that, one can design turbines and build them very differently. The reason that we have these huge 3-blade turbines is that in the 70s, the Danish corporation Vestas won out in competition with a whole lot of other firms, and led people to believe that a comparatively small number of absolutely huge turbines is the best way to go, as opposed to a very large number of small turbines. In the former case is very efficient for capital. The latter case is actually better aesthetically, or better for some people aesthetically. And I'll leave, I see a lot of hands, so let me just add one little factoid, mathematical factoid that most people don't know. The amount of electricity that you can generate from any area from, let's say, 100 square kilometers of wind turbines is independent of the size of the turbines, because each turbine has to be 7 rotor diameters apart to avoid wake effects. So a very large number, sometimes 100 times as many, small turbines like those made by an American firm called Berge, which are little 5 kilowatt machines, a very, very large number of those can generate the same amount of electricity as, a smaller number of the enormous machines that some people don't like. And the Berge machines actually are a little bit like telephone poles. And so if we can get used to telephone poles, we can get used to a different design, and they don't require nearly as much concrete for the base. So let me leave it at that. Back to you, Gareth, to MC the whole thing.
Sure. Well, Zoom tends to MC itself, and we have an order of questions. Eric, followed by Daniel, and then maybe if we have maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then David can come back. Eric.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, just picking up on your New Jersey example. I was recently in the States, and I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, and there was an interview with a kind of expert about renewables. And what he was saying is that in the States, you have the majority of the populations on the 2 coasts, on the East and West Coast, but actually the best areas in which to generate, let's say, wind power are in the Midwest, where you don't necessarily have the huge concentrations of power, of population rather. So what he was arguing is that, and I think this probably relates to issues you're exploring in your book about, getting people to accept wind turbines and so on. But one of the issues he emphasized was that your huge problem here isn't just about the generation of the power, it's about the distribution, because the distribution will have to cover thousands of miles. And this will go, so the turbines and the whole distribution infrastructure will actually affect populations that don't necessarily benefit from this power in the way that the huge populations on the coast would. So really, I'm just throwing that into the discussion to see, what you have to make of that.
Daniel.
So now, thanks a lot. It was a very interesting talk. I hope you can hear me right. I have a few remarks and also some questions. First of all, I want to point out, because you said that in your opinion, this transition to renewables is also a matter of the social transition, or that Europe or other countries fail to understand the energy transition also as a social transition. Also in regard to harvesting minerals, rare earth and whatsoever, we have a big problem when we look at social justice from a global perspective. So I think when we think about wind development, it's always important, of course, to see what conflicts are locally, how can we generate more acceptance, but also the global perspective is quite crucial. And I think this is even harder to overcome in the long run. The next remark is regarding the scarcity of the wind. I think it's still a problem, especially in regard to fossil fuels, which are also scarce, but different, because wind will always be scarce and it cannot be easily distributed as like oil barrels, where you can always get to your reserves whatsoever. Okay, so the next question, now these were my remarks. Now I have some questions. So the first thing I really would like to know is, what's the difference between the fossil fuel regime and the new renewable energy regime from your point of view? Because actually I do research on wind ownership myself in a research project here in Germany. And we conducted several interviews, especially with, with onshore and offshore stakeholders. But now we realize that, especially when it comes to offshore, there is no such thing as equal distribution of benefits or whatsoever. We see that huge investors like BlackRock invest into the offshore market, and also, especially when it comes to community ownership schemes, it's literally impossible to invest into offshore. And also in Germany, for example, we kind of swapped to offshore because it's easier to build wind parks there. And also seeing all those other huge investors, which were heavily invested in the fossil fuel regime like BP, Shell, and so on, they also heavily invest into wind power, which is kind of terrifying to me personally. Okay, and so the next question I'm really curious about is that is the solution that you offer in your book. Because you say one way would be to claim terawatts and to detach wind rights from land rights. I also see that this is one of the main issues when it comes to wind development, that wind rights are also always connected to land or land rights, and how this can be overcome. So I find this idea interesting to claim terawatts, but then also the question is, how can you claim a commons? And how can this work out? For example, in the US, we have the severance of wind rights. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a concept that you can already sell your wind rights, but I don't think that in this particular case it works, because it's just for private persons. People who already own land can sell their wind rights. Okay, but now I think I go too far ahead. Very sorry, I see you nodding.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, that's all I want to ask and remark. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So several questions there, David.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's see. Let me start with you, Eric. So you're absolutely right that the wind resource in the Midwest of the US is quite enormous, and we don't have so much onshore on the East and West Coast. So, you know, there are two approaches here. What I think capital wants, as I said, is a smaller number of very large wind farms. And so the ones in the Midwest plus whatever is built offshore is very, very usable, very strategic for them. In that case, you're always going to involve long lines of transmission, right? No investors are supporting a community level wind generation or solar generation in cities and so on. And this is something that I'm working on now, is about solar in cities. It's very inefficient to climb up onto every roof and put panels. By inefficient, I mean creating a lot of jobs and developing the neighborhood, not something capital wants to do. However, that is certainly the best thing for resilience. So when the grid goes down, what you want is generation in your neighborhood. And by the way, vertical axis wind turbines will work pretty well in cities. And because you can put them right next to each other, there are no wake effects. And you can put them on a roof line, they're pretty lightweight. You can put them on a roof line right next to each other in a row towards the prevailing wind. There is almost zero investor support for that. They're not as efficient in terms of the generation that you get, electricity that you get at a given wind speed. But you don't need to be 100% efficient. Being 75 or 50% efficient is good enough for resilience in a city. So I'm thinking now about how to reduce the transmission. But I'm also thinking that we need grid diversity, right? We need some local microgrids in neighborhoods, particularly poor neighborhoods. And then we need some really huge grids, and we might even need the grand fantasy of a Eurasia and Africa-wide grid to deal with the intermittency that you have when the wind is blowing some places and not other places, and of course, when it's nighttime in some other places. But you're right, nobody wants to live next to a transmission line. And those of us who oppose fossil fuels and find the turbine to be sublime, we don't really find the transmission tower to be sublime, and nobody wants to look at those. So maybe this is the reason to go with Gareth's statement there about nationalizing wind rights, because if the unit of ownership matches the very large unit of the grid, then the people suffering from transmission lines will get some compensation through national level wind rights. So maybe that's the reason to scale up in terms of the ownership unit. Let me respond to you here, Daniel. You said a lot. I actually think that scarcity and abundance are not really great terms to describe energy, because with fossil fuels, you have a stock, and with renewables, you have a flow. And so, all stocks are finite at the end of the day. The world is making more fossil fuels, but at such a slow rate, we might as well treat them as finite. Now, the flow could be large or it could be small. The flow of sunlight is tremendously large. The flow of wind energy, which is of course derived from sunlight, is pretty huge too, but a lot smaller than wind, a lot larger than fossil fuels, but a lot smaller than wind. But the point is that it's a flow. So it's always coming. It's not depletable. It's not just, it's not subtractable. I'm sure you know this. So the problem then is just the intermittency, right? The intermittency is the only real problem that we have of wind in comparison to fossil fuels. And that can be overcome through a very large grid, through storage, but storage, if it's done through batteries, involves the kind of material concerns, particularly around lithium and cobalt, that Gareth was talking about. There are other forms of storage like big springs and pumped hydro and so on, but they take a huge amount, they take a lot of space, and the flywheels work for quick startup things like running trains. Or we can live with less continuous electricity. I've written about this in Boston Review, and the funny way that people who say they want continuous electricity seem to believe that they're using continuous electricity. And if you ask them, well, do you think your fridge runs continuously, your refrigerator? And they say, yes, well, of course. And then you say to them, well, if it's cooling your food continuously, wouldn't your food all freeze and go down to absolute zero eventually? And they say, well, no, of course it has a thermostat. And then you say, well, that means it's not running continuously, doesn't it? And so, we could also, it's in fact, I think it's part of capitalism, particularly global capitalism with its continuous flow of materials and money, finance capitalism, that's led us to believe that we need electricity continuously, that we couldn't use it episodically or intermittently. The second part of your question has to do with the regime or the investment regime, I think you meant, around wind. I think what's going on is quite fascinating. I write about this in the book. You do have firms like BlackRock, and you have investment houses like BlackRock and firms like Equinor and BP and GE Energy Financials that are investing heavily in renewables and in fossil fuels. I mean, Equinor changed its name from Statoil, I think, in order to say, hey, we're equal. We're doing the natural gas and we're doing the renewables. Now, part of that, you should never give money or time to such a firm, because as I've said, the thing that really matters is divesting and shutting down fossil fuels. So if somebody tells me they're investing $1 in fossil fuels and they're investing $1 in wind, I am not going to congratulate them for investing $1 in wind. I'm going to say, you're doing something terrible there with the first dollar you mentioned, right? And so, but why would you want to do that if you're an investor? I mean, what it has shaped is a situation where we're having an additive energy transition rather than a replacement one. Richard York has written quite persuasively about this and done an analysis in a bunch of countries where, we're adding wind in the UK and Germany and so on, Denmark and Spain, and adding solar. But it's just increasing consumption, it's just increasing electricity production. And what Equinor, I think, would want is to continue this forward. And in 20 years from now, we would be at 50% grid density for renewables, but we'd be at plus 100% in terms of consumption. So we double the size of the grid, but we make all the additional stuff renewables. And then all the money being made now in fossil fuels is still being made, plus a whole lot more, maybe just the same amount more in renewables, okay? And because we're burning the same amount of fossil fuels, we haven't actually cut carbon emissions at all, right? I think this is the model for that fraction of capital. It's somewhat disappointing. The capitalist in me is disappointed because these firms missed, the capitalist in me, which is very small, is disappointed because they missed an opportunity. I wrote a book about the oil and gas sector in Trinidad and Tobago. And, I was constantly puzzled by why these firms, and BP was one of them, didn't go big on renewables. And I had conversations with people where I said, look, or they would say to me, look, we're not really an oil and gas company. We're an infrastructure company. We build stuff at huge scales. We negotiate with governments. We get rights. And occasionally we push communities around and we do all of these huge projects. And so I'd say, well, why don't you make the renewable grid your huge project? Why don't you capture governments, capture markets like you do, push people like my informants in Sereno, push them around and build the new grid and retire the old one, and you do it all and you make all the money. And because this is what you're good at. And they'd say, no, we don't want to do that. There's too many sunk costs in oil and gas. So, they missed their moment. And now there's Siemens, there's Gamesa, there are other firms that are making money on the renewables. But again, it's all kind of concentrated up because even above Equinor and GE Financials, there are the so-called eco-investor types, and they're splitting their money over the whole energy sector to make money on both sides of the energy transition, and therefore to shape the energy transition to be, in climate terms, to be a failure.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions? I just wanted to ask one very brief science question, David. I mean, you probably have looked into this. The Earth is heating up, so there's going to be more, you know, the system will have more energy. So there's presumably a tendency to more wind. On the other hand, the temperature gradient, which produces most of the wind between the Arctic and the tropics, is decreasing as the Arctic heats much faster than anywhere else. So the jet stream starts to meander, and there are signs of there being quite a bit less wind. Is this something you've looked into, and is this which direction is the wind going in?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have not looked into it a whole lot. In Andalusia, you know, around the Strait of Gibraltar, they expect there to be more wind, but for it to be more changeable and more turbulent. So
Right.
what you would expect overall when there's more energy in the system, and this is what we're seeing in terms of extreme weather, you'd expect there to be just a lot of volatility. And that's not actually good for generating electricity, because what you want is you want a constant even wind. And it doesn't need to be that fast. You just want it constantly going all the time. And turbulence wears out wind turbines. You know, it knocks the rotors around and so on. The whole mechanism wears out, has to be replaced. Again, that's probably great for jobs, not great for the carbon, the embedded energy of materials. But you know, the wind sector is slightly worried about this. But I don't see it as being a deal breaker in any. I mean, the reasons to worry about global warming are bigger ones than that. But that I haven't really looked into it a whole lot, Gareth.
Sure. Do we have any final questions from anyone? Last call. Isaac.
I'm more interested in the aesthetics, and what I find is in the Netherlands, these old these mills that they used for grinding is almost the kind of symbol of the ecology movement. And then also in places like Australia, the windmill is quite a loved symbol almost of the farmers and rural Australians. Is there any overflow between is there any overflow in meaning between these wind generators and the windmills?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, in Spain you have Cervantes and you have Don Quixote de la Mancha.
Don Quixote, yes.
Yes, and so I often ask people, you know, who are opposed to turbines, you know, I say, well, why don't you just see them as larger windmills? You know, a mill being the wind generation machine to grind stuff. And they'd say, no, these ones are so different. They're so much larger. They're different materials. And I'll say a word about materials in that sense. And the ones in Cervantes' time were beautiful, right? And then I'd say, well, Cervantes didn't find them beautiful. And they'd say, what do you mean? I'd say, well, you know, the reason why Cervantes chose the windmill as the kind of imaginary giant for Don Quixote to joust against was that it was this ugly thing. It was the closest architectural thing to a giant, to a threatening giant that Cervantes imagined. All right, so that shows you that yesterday's ugly industrial intrusion becomes today's, you know, pastoral nostalgia. Raymond Williams has written about that, and he says it takes 2 generations. So the solution possibly to all the aesthetic quandaries, all the aesthetic qualms about wind turbines is to wait 50 years. But we don't have 50 years, so we have to accelerate the process. On the materials side, I mean, this is the problem we're in, or let's say the disjuncture between windmills and wind turbines is a consequence of that victory that Vestas won in the 70s on design, right? They went for the 3-blade design and they went for very large machines. In southern Spain, the windmills are usually 6 blades, and the cloth, the blades are actually made of sailcloth. And I've advocated sailcloth offshore in the East Coast of the US because it fits with local traditions. And, you know, you can imagine a wind turbine as being a sailboat where the sail turns and the vessel is stationary instead of the other way around. And you could, especially if you saw them from far off, I think it would look a little bit like a fleet of sailboats. And if the famous firm Cape Wind had proposed that design in that way 20 years ago, then maybe they would have beaten the Kennedys. I don't know if you know this microhistory, the Kennedys and other wealthy sailors in Cape Cod who defeated the first offshore wind proposal in the US and set us back 10 or 20 years. So, and sailcloth wears out all the time. So that's fabulous for employment. It means people have to climb up and replace it very frequently, not like carbon fiber blades. But again, you know, we have a design that is high modernist and that is efficient for capital, and therefore that throws away all of the vernacular aesthetic traditions, and also then throws away the residual goodwill, which I think is out there among rural people to support this energy transition if it honors their history and if it actually appropriately fills their pocketbook to some extent. So what I'm basically trying to say, I'm trying to redirect the energy transition in aesthetic and political ways so that it takes advantage, as an anthropologist would, to redirect this high modernist project so that it takes advantage of the strong opportunities that I see in places like Sereno.
And finally, Eric, your hand is up.
Yeah, this is just more out of curiosity in relation to your own work, because Brunel Latour, who's a kind of anthropologist, has recently written quite a bit about, you know, the climate crisis and so on, his book Facing Gaia. Obviously, he's coming at this in a very, very different way than you are, but I was just curious as to whether you have any views about his work, how you see the relevance of it, or whether you think it's kind of not relevant at all.
Yeah, well, so I mean, actor network theory is all the rage among anthropologists, and now we call it ontology all the time, and sometimes multi-species ethnography. I think it's telling that at the very moment when it became apparent, as Dipesh Chakravarty says, that some humans are acting as geological agents and acting like God in terms of changing the conditions for life, not all humans, just a billion high emitters, are acting in this way, that social scientists should find us a get out of jail free card and say, oh, no, it's much more complicated than that. Everything that a human being does is done in an alliance. I can't remember Brunel Latour's very complicated terms, but done in an alliance with a non-human actant. And that somehow oil is always inviting us to burn it, and has, you know, since we were Neanderthals and so on. And, you know, the book I wrote about oil and gas was directly about the responsibility of some of the people I met in oil and gas firms and how they grapple in terms of conscience, how they grapple with that responsibility and how they think about morality in scientific and political economic terms. I think it's no different in the wind sector. We have enormous energy resources, and we have to manage them in one way or another for the benefit of each other and for the continuation of the conditions for life. So I'm frustrated by my colleagues kind of turning away from the problem. And I see this institutionally in anthropology, because we're a very high carbon footprint field, not only for the field work, but before the pandemic, for all the flying around and hobnobbing, and the fact that, you know, if there weren't a pandemic, I might be with you now, having flown to London. That's not sustainable, of course. And it's not necessary, because we're doing this well enough on the web. Before the pandemic, people like me have an incredibly hard time trying to persuade anthropologists that we should cut our carbon emissions. Because there's a kind of over theorizing and abstraction that goes on around these processes. So I do blame Latour somewhat for that. And I don't think it's been a helpful, let's say that what he derides as the modernist settlement, I think is actually a very useful way of understanding the world right now in terms of figuring out the industrial reforms we need to make.
Good, thank you.
Right. Well, thanks very much to everyone for taking part in the discussion, and above all to David for coming and sharing his thoughts on wind power with us and launching his book. I should emphasize that this is an incredibly multifaceted book. There's a lot in it, and we've only touched on, really only in the discussion, we've touched on the wind power issues, but there's an awful lot more to the book than we've been discussing here. That the legal questions, for example, are fascinating, and above all, just the basic ethnography. The book starts with with a list of the characters, Carolina and Raul and Veronica and so on and so on, and we get to know them over the course of the book, and how they're thinking on these gargantuan structures in a nearby field is influencing David's thoughts on the question and the politics of wind power. So yeah, so I'd recommend the book to everyone, and thanks very much to David for joining us. And this is one of a series of sustainability politics research seminars we're having at Brunel University. There'll be another 4 or 5 next term. So thanks everyone. I'll end the meeting now. Oh, one final point I must ask to Eric and Isaac and Daniel. I'll put this video up online if you would like. I mean, I imagine you're fine with your comments having been recorded. If you're not, do email me and I can edit them out. Great. Well, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Gareth.